As you work to finish a project, you'll need to share audio and MIDI files with your collaborators. Let's take a look at how you can export clips and tracks and entire mixes from Arrangement View. So I've got exercise 2 from chapter 13 open. And let's start by exporting just a single clip. Now, one thing that we can do very quickly is to export a MIDI file. So if I select this sine bass clip on this sine bass track, I can just right-click on the clip itself, and I can choose Export MIDI Clip from the contextual menu. And I'll briefly mention that this is different than other programs where we could export all of the MIDI from the entire arrangement window as one MIDI file. Here we can only do it a clip at a time. So I'll go Export MIDI Clip. It's taking the name from the track that I had selected, and I'm going to put that on my desktop here, and I'll go ahead and click Save. And now if I go to my desktop, we can see that I've got that sinebass.mid available there. Now, I can also export this as an audio file, and I can select the entire clip by clicking its title, or I can select a portion of the clip, if necessary, by dragging on the bottom half and selecting the portion that I might want to export. But let's go ahead and select the entire clip, and then let's go up to the File menu, and let's choose Export Audio. Now there are several choices to make here. So under Rendered Track, you can choose to render the entire mix, that would be the master, all individual tracks, which would render each track in the session as an individual audio file, or selected tracks, which would include only those tracks whose track nameplates have been selected, or we have a list of all of the individual tracks and we can do them one at a time. So let's go sine bass for this example. And while here, I'll double check to see what the selection is. So note that this says bar 20. As I look out here, yeah, my selection was starting at bar 20, and it is about 10 measures long. So let's render that. Now, if we need to, we could shorten that or make a different start point by typing values here. Under the rendering options, we can choose to include any return or master effects with this rendering of this clip. Now, what this is referring to is if there is a send on this bass track that's copying signal over to one of the return tracks that has delay or reverb on it, it will capture that as part of the rendered audio file here. Similarly, if there is something like a limiter or some EQ on the master, it will also pick up that processing as part of the rendered file. The next option here, Render as Loop, will take any resulting reverb tail or delay tail that's part of this clip, and it will write it back around to the beginning of the resulting audio file so that as this loops, we'll actually get the necessary ambience that would have been created and would be there on a MIDI file that was looping where we had delay or reverb on the track. Next option we have here is to convert to mono. And since this is a bass file, I don't want to end up with a stereo audio file. And that would be the same thing for me if this was a vocal file or mini synth, guitar, or keyboard tracks. The next option we have here is to normalize. And in this case, Live will analyze the file for any peaks in the audio waveform, and then it will maximize the level without any clipping or distortion. And in essence, it's going to make this file as loud as it can. Next, we can choose to create an analysis file. So just remember that the resulting audio file from this clip, if I bring that into any live project, it's going to immediately get analyzed and an analysis file will be created. It's that .asd file. So to me, it doesn't matter whether we do it now or it happens later when I import it into another project. Next, we can choose the sample rate of the resulting file. 44.1 is the consumer standard, and we have other options here which are multiples of 44.1 and 48 for high-res audio. We also have options lower than that for things like spoken word, where the audio resolution doesn't need to be as high. I'll leave that on 44.1. We can then choose the file type that we're rendering to, and if we enable the PCM button, we will have the options for WAV and AIF, which are uncompressed audio file types, as well as FLAC, which is a lossless audio codec. And I'm going to choose AIF here. And then for my bit depth, I can choose 16, 24, or 32. And if this, again, is a consumer standard file that we're going to, you would typically go to 16. The other important thing to remember here is that higher bit depths give you greater dynamic range. And if you're choosing maybe to bring that back into this live set, well, then you'd probably want this to be at 24-bit or higher. Also, if you're bouncing an audio file and you are lowering the bit depth, you're going to want to make sure that you include dither. If not, we can turn this off if it's going to be rendered at the same bit depth. In this case, I'm rendering this audio file for the first time because it's coming from MIDI, so I am going to include dither. And our options here are triangular or these power options. Triangular is said to be the most transparent in Live's manual, but the power options are widely used in the audio industry. So I would suggest that you bounce several versions of this with different dither types and then listen and choose the one that you think best fits your music. Let's go ahead and leave that on triangular, and I'll go ahead and export this. It's going to ask me to give it a name. Let's call this sine bass clip. And again, I'll put that on the desktop. We'll click the Save button. Since I didn't choose a very long selection, it's doing this very quickly. And if we go back out to the desktop, we can see now that we have the sine bass clip.aif, and I must have had the MP3 button enabled as well, because we got an MP3 version of that too. Now, let's do one more bounce, and this time, let's do something like, let's do the key sub. Now, I could either select this track and bounce the selected track, which in this case is going to be a submix of all of my keyboard parts, or I could set a selection. In this case, I've already got the loop brace set to the length that I want. I can select that loop brace so that when I go to bounce this, Ableton sees that as my selection. So this is set to bounce from bar 1 to the end, and if that's not correct, remember you can trim the edges, or you can simply select the length that you want, like this guitar split, which looks to be the longest clip in the track, and you can use the key command, Command L or Control L on a PC to set your loop brace to that, and then you can extend the loop brace if you want to add a handle to the beginning and ending of the audio clip that you're about to export. So let's do that. Let's go File, Export. In this case, I'm going to change this to my key sub. The render start is bar 1, beat 1, and the length is 69 bars. I want to include the return and master effects. I don't need to render this as a loop. I don't want that to be in mono. Don't need to normalize this. I'm not worried about an analysis file because I'm not going to be bringing this into a project. And I'll leave this at the sample rate of 44.1 and 16-bit. Let's see, let's leave that as an AIF and a triangular dither option. And yes, let's also encode this as an MP3. So let's go ahead and click the export button. I'm going to call this my key split. And I'll go ahead and put that on the desktop. Okay, let's go back out to the desktop and let's check. And we can see that, yeah, we got a key split, a bounce, and we've got an MP3 from that. Now, if we go back to our export dialog, I'll just point out the only difference between bouncing a stem, as I just did here for the key submix, would be to just set this to master and click export, and we would then get an export of the entire live set here, or the entire song. So we've covered how to export clips, tracks, and entire projects, and even MIDI files from Arrangement View. Check out the next video where we'll discuss the differences in exporting files from Session View.